In today's video number 8, we are going to discuss the third part of the first unit. Development experience from 1947 to 1990 we saw in our previous videos. Now here we are going to deal with the economic reform since 1991. So what happened from 1947 to 1990? We know that we had a stagnant economy, but after independence, the economy started to grow. And we also saw that 85% of the population was engaged in agriculture. And after the independence, we adopted the mixed economy, which is a combination of socialist and the capitalist economies that would look into the social welfare as its main motive. Then in 1950, when the Planning Commission was set up, then we thought of the 5-year plans. And the first 5-year plans focused on agriculture, industries, and the small-scale industries. Now, during this time, we found the growth rate or the GDP improved. The GDP from the agricultural sector was 3.6%, and from the industrial sector, it was 4.1%. Due to the introduction of Green Revolution, we also had food security that was ensured. We had export surplus. However, in 1991, India met with an economic crisis that related to external debt, which increased, and the government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings. The foreign exchange reserves, which are maintained to import products or items, dropped to levels that were not sufficient even for a single fortnight. And we also came across a crisis of that was called inflation. What is inflation? It is rise in prices of essential goods. So this led the government to introduce a new set of policies, that is the reform policies of 1991 or the new economic policy of 1991. What was the reason for these reform policies? Why reform policies? Not being able to repay the loans that we had taken from the external world. Why did that happen? Because we did not have enough revenue from taxation. And then the public sector units incurred heavy losses. Increase in unemployment, poverty, population explosion, all these contributed to losses. And this was combined with huge spending on social sector and defense, which do not provide immediate returns. And then we had whatever was borrowed from the other countries was just spent on meeting consumption needs. Imports grew at a very high rate that did not match the growth of the exports. And also there was inflation, that is rise in prices. The foreign exchange reserves also declined to a level that was not adequate to finance imports for more than 2 weeks. And now, because of all these problems, we did not have any lenders that would help India. Nobody was willing to lend us any money. So what did we do? We approached the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for help. But then the International Monetary Fund laid certain conditions. It did offer a help of $7 billion as loan to manage this crisis. But it laid down certain conditions. What were these conditions? These were that India would liberalize and open up its economy. It would remove the restrictions on the private sector. Remember, the quantity produced by these industrialists in the private sector was restricted. Now they could produce more. And then to reduce the role of the government in many areas. At the time of independence, government was looking into social welfare. And so it restricted the entry or the role of the private sector and said that the public sector units were more important because that was for social welfare. So the government was spending a lot of money in these. We also just now saw the social sector and defense, which did not provide us with immediate returns. The government was spending huge amounts in them. So the government was asked to reduce its role in many areas. Then also to remove trade restrictions between India and other countries. So this is called a policy of globalization. That means the restriction on imports and exports was lifted. And hence India announced its new economic policy in the year 1991. These policies can be broadly classified into two groups: the stabilization measures and the structural reform policies. The stabilization measures are short term measures which are intended to correct the balance of payments. Then these also aim at maintaining sufficient foreign exchange reserves. And this would also bring inflation under control. Then structural reform policies are long-term measures. They increase international competitiveness by removing the rigidities in various segments of the Indian economy. And they include the three elements of the new economic policy, that is to include liberalization, privatization, and globalization, together called the LPG. Let's look at this LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, one after the other. What is liberalization? Liberty means freedom. So it would be to free Indian businesses and industries from unnecessary controls and restrictions. And the reforms in 1991 were more comprehensive than those in 1980s and covered more important areas, some more important areas like the industrial sector, the financial sector, tax reforms, foreign exchange markets, trade, and investment sectors. So let's look at them one after the other. First of them was deregulation of industrial sector of the economy. That means industrial licensing was abolished, except for certain hazardous chemicals, alcohol, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, drugs, and pharmaceuticals. The number of industries reserved for public sector was reduced, and now public sector included only the defense equipment, atomic energy generation, and railways. The products from the small scale industries were de-reserved. What does this mean? That the forces of the market were allowed to determine allocation of resources. We remember, right, that some of the products were restricted only for or reserved only for the small scale industries to be produced. Then markets could determine prices. What to produce, how much to produce was now a matter of producer's choice, and it depended on the market conditions. Then the second is financial sector reforms. In India, financial sector is regulated and controlled by the RBI, or the Reserve Bank of India. And the financial sector includes institutions like commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange operations, and forex or foreign exchange market. Now, what is the role of an RBI in India? That it decides the cash reserve ratio, the statutory liquidity ratio, and the bank rate. The cash reserve ratio, or the CRR, is a fraction of deposits that commercial banks must keep as cash reserves with the RBI. Then SLR, or the statutory liquidity ratio, is a fraction of deposits that commercial banks must keep with themselves. And then the bank rate is a rate of interest at which commercial banks can borrow from RBI. Reforms in the financial sectors were as follows. This reduced the role of the RBI from regulator to facilitator. Then here the private banks were established. Foreign investment limits were raised to 50%. And then the banks were free to set up new branches and branch networks. Earlier this was decided by the RBI, but after this policy, after the financial sector reforms, the banks were free to set up new branches and also branch networks. Then they would be able to generate resources from India and also abroad. Then foreign institutional investors, FIIs, were now allowed to invest in Indian financial markets. So those were the reforms in the financial sector. Let's look at the tax reforms or the fiscal policy. What does this mean? These are concerned with reforms in the government's taxation and public expenditure policies, which together is called as the fiscal policy. Now, the indirect taxes, that is which is paid by the individuals, that is income tax, and the corporate tax were reduced. This was only to encourage savings and voluntary disclosure of income. If the taxes are high, people generally evade taxation. So, these taxes were reduced only to voluntary disclosure of income. Then indirect taxes. The tax procedures were simplified. GST was brought in 2016, which was effective from July 2017. This was to create one nation, one tax, and one market. Isn't it? So this was expected to generate additional revenue for the government. And it did. So the revenue of the government increased. Now reforms in foreign exchange, or external sector reforms we can call it. Under this, the rupee was devalued. Devaluation of rupee increases the value of the foreign exchange. That means when rupee is devalued, the value of the other currency increases. So what happens? This leads to increase in exports and inflow of foreign exchange. This was done to resolve the balance of payment crisis. Okay. Then foreign exchange deregulation. It is freeing the determination of foreign exchange rate from government control. Then foreign exchange rate was determined by the demand and supply or market forces. That's the reason we often hear every day, today the dollar rate is this much, tomorrow the dollar rate would be that much. So how is this determined? This is determined only by the demand and the supply of the foreign exchange in the market. Under trade and investment policy reforms, we must remember over here that India was following a regime of quantitative restrictions and the policy of import substitution. Yeah. So this was encouraged through tight control over imports and keeping the tariffs very high. But under these reforms, the tariff rates were reduced and licensing for imports was also removed. The quantitative restrictions were dismantled and export duties were removed to increase competitive position of Indian goods in the international market. So the objectives of liberalization and trade and investment regime was to increase international competitiveness of industrial production, to increase foreign investments in technology into the economy, to promote local industries, and finally to adopt modern technologies. So that's about liberalization. In our next video, we will learn about privatization.